We're looking at 7 of the most shocking upsets in chess history, where complete underdogs took down the best in the world. Bobby Fischer is our first world champion, and he starts e4 best by test. Black replies e5, and don't go anywhere because the last game in this video has Bobby Fischer checkmated in 22 moves. In this one, Fischer goes for the Italian game, and Black also brings his bishop out to c5. White's b4 is the Evans Gambit, giving up the pawn which Black takes to lure the Black bishop away from the center, and into another attack after White's c3. The bishop drops back before White breaks in the center with d4. Black takes the pawn, and White can't take back because of the pin on the pawn to the king, so he castles his king out of the way. Then Black develops his knight from g to e7, preparing to castle too. Fischer aggressively jumps his knight to g5, coordinating with his bishop onto f7. Now castling for Black would be dangerous here because of queen to h5 with a strong attack to follow. So going back, Black plays d5 instead. A clever idea that at first looks like it only blocks the bishop, but after White takes the pawn, Black does not recapture, instead jumping his knight to e5 to attack the bishop again while bolstering the defense of his f7 pawn. After White's bishop retreats, Black castles his king to safety. Fischer follows with a nifty tactic here. Knight takes h7. Black takes the sacrifice piece, walking his king right into a fork with White's queen h5, which hits the king and the knight. After Black drops his king back, White takes the piece, before Black grabs the pawn on c3. Once White recaptures with his knight, Black takes that knight, removing not just one defender of the d5 pawn, but also luring the White queen away from its defense as it has to recapture the bishop. Black is then able to take the pawn on d5 with his knight, emerging up one pawn against a formidable foe in Fischer. This last move comes with an attack on White's queen, so she slides over to g3, peering the enemy king. Black develops his final minor piece, overprotecting his knight, and White puts his bishop on b2, threatening a checkmate on g7. Black drops his knight to block the diagonal while offering a piece exchange. White says no deal, dropping his bishop to c2, and Black jumps his knight forward to h5, still keeping an eye on the g7 pawn while hitting White's queen, who sidesteps to f3, counterattacking the knight. So Black lifts his queen to d5, protecting his knight while persistently offering piece exchanges. Fischer blocks the trade with bishop to e4 while pushing the Black queen over to g5. He then wins back the pawn with a capture on b7 that hits the rook, who shifts over to b8. The White bishop is protected, but it shouldn't move because the bishop behind it is not protected. For now, White swings his rook over from a to e1, centralizing, and Black again moves his queen to g4, trying to trade off the queens. White follows with bishop to e5 with the plan to meet a Black queen trade by recapturing with his bishop, creating an attack on Black's knight, and once it would move, White would emerge up a clean pawn by capturing on c7 in a better endgame. Back to the game, Black avoids this, instead patiently dropping his knight back to safety on f6, and setting a subtle trap for his renowned rival. A trap that the frustrated Fischer falls right into, as he quickly captures the pawn on c7, finally going up material. But to his utter disbelief, this advantage is short-lived, as Black swipes the bishop on b7, starting a brilliant tactical sequence. White doesn't have much choice here because he's down a full piece, so he takes the rook back. And here's your chance. Can you find the only winning move in this position and defeat a world chess champion? Black's queen is pressuring the g2 square, and White's queen is protecting it, but she's misplaced on this diagonal. Black's knight is defending the d5 square, so the move Black plays to win the game is bishop to d5. Fischer resigns the game, putting Black in an exclusive club of world champion conquerors. This move not only hits the queen, but threatens a checkmate on g2. White would have to give up the queen for the bishop, going down a queen for a rook and a pawn. The great world champion Garry Kasparov is the next opponent, and after white starts e4, he plays c5, the Sicilian defense. White's knight f3 prepares a break in the center, and after e6 opening up the king side, white strikes. Black takes the pawn, and white recaptures with the knight before black develops his to f6, hitting e4. White defends it with knight to c3, and black plays d6, creating a tight but timid setup in the center. White follows with bishop e2, paving the lane for a castle, and black follows with a6, stopping white's pieces from getting to b5. After white castles, black develops his knight from b to d7. The fireworks kick off right away with f4 moving forward on the king side, and Kasparov's b5 expanding on the queen side. Now black may play b4 here to remove the defense of e4, so white defends his pawn with bishop to f3. Black adds an attacker with bishop to b7, and white plays a3, stopping black's b4 altogether. Black develops his queen to c7, and with potential threats against his king, white sidesteps his king out of danger. Black advances with h5, gaining some kingside space, and white develops his final minor piece with bishop to e3. Kasparov's knight c5, activating his knight, is followed by white's e5, sending shockwaves down the center. Black takes with his pawn, and white recaptures with his pawn, kicking black's knight, who jumps to g5. White doesn't want to take that knight because it would give black an open h-file to work with after he would recapture. Instead, he grabs black's bishop on b7, which has the added benefit that it lures the black queen away from an attack on his e5 pawn. Then white makes use of black's h5 move, which weakens the g5 square by planting his bishop on g5. This makes it difficult for black to develop his bishop and get castled. For now, white takes the free pawn on e5, going up material, but at what cost? Here, white seizes the initiative, something Kasparov is known to do himself, starting with queen e2, a developing move with tempo. Black drops his other knight defending, and white rapidly swings his rook over into the center. Black finally develops his bishop, and white follows with an amazing move, knight to e4. Black absolutely should not take white's bishop because it would hang a royal fork after knight d6, which would win the queen. So, instead of this, black sidesteps his queen to c7, protecting the d6 square. And white takes black's bishop, forcing Kasparov's king into the center since it has to recapture. White jumps his knight to g5 next with a cruel threat. Were black to play a random move, let's say h4, white would sacrifice his rook on f7, removing the defense of the e6 pawn. After black would take the rook, white's queen would grab the pawn on e6, supported by his knight, with a check that would push the king back to d8. At the very least, white would be able to win some material after knight takes f7, forking the king and rook, but surely white would have a very strong attack on black's king to follow. Back to the game, Kasparov sees this threat, so he defends his f-pawn with his rook, and white plays the subtle queen e1, looking to jump to h4 with new attacking opportunities. But there's no need for a complicated attack, because black jumps his knight forward to c5, maybe with the idea of defending his e6 pawn so that he can safely play f6 to kick away white's knight. But white has a way to win the game here. Can you find white's wonderful winning combination? After black's last move, his knight has one less defender. And you might notice something familiar about the formation of black's pieces. If you can't see it yet, you will see it soon because the move white plays to win the game is queen takes e5, and Kasparov resigns the game. Now there is a forced checkmate here no matter what black would play, and this is thanks to the powerful placement of all of white's pieces that work together to lock up the black king. But to put it simply, white just went up a full piece, and were black to take the queen, then knight c6 could win it back, or even better, get a forced checkmate. The third opponent is the captivating world champion Capablanca, and he starts e4. The game heads into a Ruy Lopez after white's bishop to b5, and black develops his other knight to f6. Even though this hits the e4 pawn, white castles. Since were black to take it, white's rook to e1 would probably win that pawn back. So instead, black solidifies his center pawn with d6, and white protects his own pawn with knight to c3. Black's bishop to d7 breaks the pin on his knight, and white breaks in the center with d4. Black keeps the tension, playing h6 to stop white's other bishop from pinning his other knight, and white swipes the first knight off the board to remove a defender of e5. After black recaptures, Capablanca takes on e5. Black sees that taking back is probably not a great idea, since it could prematurely open up the e-file where black's king would still be stuck in the center. Going back, instead of this, black takes on e4, which leads to many piece exchanges. White first takes back on e4, and after black recaptures with his bishop, white plays queen e2, hitting the bishop while peering black's king. Black takes the knight on f3 and the queen recaptures. This lets black take the pawn on e5, but in return, white gets the pawn on b7, giving black a weak pawn structure with two isolated pawns on the queen side. Black develops his bishop out to d6 next, preparing to castle, but Capablanca inserts queen to c6 check. Now black should not block with his queen here because it would hang the rook in the corner, so he has to lift his king out of check. White follows with b3, opening up the square for his bishop, and black now lifts his queen to d7, connecting his rooks and offering a queen trade. White knows that black's king isn't very safe in the center, so he declines the trade, trying to keep pieces on the board. But black is able to gain some central space with f5 while hitting the queen again. She drops to e2, keeping an eye on black's king, and black slides his rook over to f8. Capablanca develops his bishop on the long diagonal, and black plays the sneaky e4. This opens up his bishop, but also gives up the g-pawn, which white takes. But black shifts his rook over a square, taking advantage of a now semi-open file aimed at white's king. White greedily grabs a second pawn, only to succumb to a spectacular sacrifice. Bishop takes h2 check. White doesn't need to take that bishop, but black would have just gotten a crucial kingside pawn for free and could follow with rook to h8. So instead, white takes the piece, and black plays queen to d6 check, forking the white king and the bishop. Now white's best move here is g3, after which black would win the piece back and the game could get very sharp. Instead, Capablanca drops his king back to g1, unaware of black's crushing combination that will follow. Can you beat a nearly unbeatable world champion and find black's checkmate in 5? What we notice here is that black's pawn on e4 stops the white king from running to f3, and black has several major pieces which could set up a potential ladder checkmate on the last two files. With this idea in mind, the move black plays to win the game is the brilliant sacrifice, rook takes g2. Capablanca resigns. Now, the white king going to h1 would see a quick checkmate after queen h2. Otherwise, after taking the rook, black would play rook to g8, and black's indispensable e-pawn stops the king from running away. White would block with the bishop next, and it doesn't matter which square, black would take it with his rook, forcing the white king to the edge of the board where he would inevitably get ladder checkmated. Paul Morphy takes the stage for the next game, but not for long because this game is only 12 moves. We enter a king's gambit, which black accepts by taking the f4 pawn. White quickly develops his bishop, but this allows black's queen to h4, forcing white to surrender castling rights. Then b5 offers a pawn back to lure white's bishop away from the center. But white doesn't accept the gambit, instead playing bishop to d5 to hit black's rook. Black develops his knight to block the attack, and white's knight to f3 pushes black's queen back to h5. Morphy takes complete control over the center with d4, and black develops with a punch, hitting white's bishop a second time. It drops back to b3, and black's bishop to a6 sets up discovered check possibilities on white's king. White blocks the diagonal with his queen, but here black sees a way to potentially win the game. He grabs the pawn on d4, giving up his knight, which white takes. The queens now stare at each other, but black pushes b4, opening up his bishop's pin on white's queen. The thing is, that bishop is fully hanging. Now white's best move here is c4. This would block the diagonal while opening up the bishop's eyes on the d1 square. Instead of that move, white takes the free bishop. But this gives black a winning combination. Can you find the checkmate in 2? With the white queen nowhere near to defend, white's poor king is helpless. The move black plays to end the game is queen d1 check. King f2 is the only move, then black grabs the pawn on e4. And yes, that is an aesthetic checkmate. World champion Magnus Carlsen is the 5th opponent and he starts e4. The game enters a Roy Lopez and black defends his knight with the other knight. White plays c3 preparing a central pawn break, and black's a6 asks the question to white's bishop, who drops back 1 square. Then black plays h6, stopping any white pieces from getting to the g5 square. White breaks in the center with d4, and after black takes it, the recapture gives white a powerful central pawn duo. Black moves his knight to g6, opening up his kingside bishop, and white carries on development with knight to c3. Black proceeds with bishop to b4, pinning the knight, but Magnus gets out of the pin right away by castling. Black grabs the knight, simplifying the position slightly, and after white recaptures, black castles. White drops his bishop to c2 with ideas of pushing his pawn, then taking the knight to weaken black's kingside pawn structure. Black stops the e5 advance with d6, which also opens up his bishop. But white pushes his other central pawn, hitting the knight. So it jumps to e5, offering a trade. Magnus doesn't exchange, instead jumping his knight to a powerful post in the center. Black develops his queen to e7, and with the white knight out of the way, white fires out f4, hitting the knight. But it doesn't budge just yet, as black's bishop dashes to g4, counterattacking white's queen. She sidesteps to e1 before black drops his knight to d7. Now things are looking good for Magnus here. He pushes f5, attacking black's knight who jumps to e5. Then he plays h3, and we realize that black's bishop is about to get trapped. It has to drop to its only available square on h5. Then white plays g4, and that bishop is trapped. Black plays the desperado sacrifice, taking on g4, since he will lose the bishop anyway. White recaptures, and black takes again with his knight, getting 2 pawns for the piece. Magnus is up material here, but his kingside is dangerously exposed. Still, he can build an attack of his own, and he pushes f6 to break open black's kingside. The queen is also attacked, so she jumps to e5, threatening a checkmate on h2. White brings his bishop out to f4, blocking the threat and counterattacking the queen, who swings over to h5, keeping pressure on the h2 square. That square is defended now, however, so Magnus grabs the pawn on g7. Black decides to leave that pawn alone since it might act as a good defender for his king. So he shifts his rook over a square. Then white jumps his queen to g3, adding defense to his kingside while building up pressure on black's pieces. Black over-defends his knight with his other knight, and here Magnus plays knight f5, a move that looks good since it puts the knight on a dominant post on black's kingside, but it overlooks a small detail in the position. While black doesn't have a way to win, he does have a way to win back some material and restore equality. Can you find the move that gives black his comeback? The reason white was winning earlier is because there's still a lot of pieces on the board. But if black can trade off some pieces and win a couple pawns back, then the extra pawns he has for the piece could be just as valuable in an endgame. Well, that pawn on e4 is attacked twice and only defended once. So the move black plays to get back into the game is simply knight takes e4. This not only attacks the queen, but removes the defender of the knight. White's only good move here would be to take the knight with the bishop, after which black would recapture with the rook. The game might go on and on from this point, but with less pieces on the board, white's attack would be less powerful. Meanwhile, black would get good control over the open e-file, and he'll probably win the pawn on g7 as well. Going back, instead of taking that knight, Magnus, under some severe time pressure, tries to get a little too clever with queen takes g4. The idea is to meet black's recapture with knight takes h6, which would fork the king and the queen. But wait a second, black taking white's queen here would come with a check. So white wouldn't even be able to play knight takes h6. Magnus sees this immediately after playing queen takes g4 and resigns the game. The penultimate world champion is the positional maestro Anatoly Karpov. White starts d4 and Karpov replies knight f6. Knight f3 developing is followed by e6 and e3, with both sides opening up their queenside bishops. Black strikes with c5, and after white develops his bishop, black takes the d-pawn. White recaptures and black plays b6, opening up his other bishop. After white castles, black plays bishop to a6, trying to exchange off white's potentially powerful bishop. White blocks this with c4, and black carries on development with knight to c6. After white's knight to c3, Karpov jumps his knight to a5, hunting down white's c4 pawn. White defends by jumping his other knight to e5. Now black might try d6 here to deflect that knight away from c4's defense, but this would open up the option for queen a4, throwing a nasty check at black's king that would be hard to deal with. So going back, instead of this, black adds another attacker to the c4 pawn with rook to c8. White defends with b3, and now that white's queen can no longer go to a4, black plays d6, kicking white's knight, who jumps to g4. With white's c-pawn now strong and sturdy, Karpov drops his bishop back to b7. But this lets white get a strong space advantage after pushing his pawn to d5. Black should not take that pawn because the e-file would be opened up and rook to e1 check could hurt. So instead, black develops his bishop, trying to get castled as soon as possible. White drops his knight to e3, now with great control over the d5 square. Black's a6 stops white's other knight from getting a little too aggressive, and white develops his final minor piece with bishop to b2. Karpov finally takes the pawn on d5, and white recaptures with the knight. Black takes that too, and white recaptures with the pawn this time, keeping his strong space advantage while opening up an attack on the now hanging a6 pawn. So black pushes b5 to blunt that bishop's diagonal. Then white plays the powerful knight f5, attacking the bishop, and he's threatening rook to e1, which would pin and put immense pressure on that piece. Now were black to castle here, white would play rook to e1, threatening that bishop, who cannot move anywhere. Black might try to defend with rook to e8, but then white would sacrifice his rook for the piece, forcing black to recapture with the rook, which would cut off the queen's defense of the knight. White would grab that knight with his bishop, ruining black's kingside pawn structure. Queen g4 check would come next, pushing the king to f8, and with knight to h6 and bishop to f5 coming, and then queen to g8, white's attack would be devastating. Back to the game. Instead of castling here, Karpov sidesteps his king to f8 out of the potential pin. White shifts his rook over to e1 anyway, adding an attacker to that bishop, and black defends it with rook to c7. White tries to deflect that rook away from the bishop's defense with rook to c1, but black shifts his rook over a square. White lifts his queen to d2, hitting the knight, with the threat of taking multiple times on e7 to eventually lure black's queen away from the defense of the knight to win that piece. So black drops his knight out of the way to b7. But unfortunately for Karpov, this position is ripe with tactical opportunities for white, and white seizes one right away with knight takes g7. Now black doesn't have to take that knight, but white just won a full pawn, and queen to h6 is coming with devastating threats. So black takes the knight. White's queen jumps to g5 with check, pushing the king back to f8. He checks again with queen to h6. Now were the king to go to g8, then rook to e3 would come, and it would be pretty much unstoppable to stop rook to g3 with a checkmate to follow shortly after. Going back, so Karpov shifts his king over to e8 instead, putting his bishop right back into a dangerous pin. White exploits that pin immediately, capturing the knight on f6 to win back his piece. The rook is attacked, so it moves over to f8. Now white is up one pawn here with a dominant position. Still, there's no big material advantage just yet, but there is a way to get one. Can you find white's best possible move that wins this game? To find the move, you need to notice that black's bishop is pinned and under attack several times. It's also well defended though, but white can remove a defender, and the move he plays to do that is bishop to f5. After seeing this, Karpov resigns the game. White's going to take that rook and then take the bishop, and there's nothing black can do about it. Even if he were to move his rook, white would take it, and after the queen would recapture, white could choose between queen to e3, which would probably lead to a checkmate, or simply taking the bishop with his rook while forking the queen and king to eventually win that too. This last game is absolutely mind-boggling, but it has an unbelievable ending. Bobby Fischer makes his return and starts e4. Black follows with e5, and both sides develop knights on opposite sides before Fischer plays the aggressive f4. Black hits right back with d4, creating chaotic tension in the center right away. White's e-pawn is hit twice, so white defends it with queen f3, and black develops his bishop to c5. Now Fischer could take the e-pawn for free here, but he takes on d5 instead. Black jumps his bishop to g4, hitting white's queen, who sidesteps to g3. Then black castles his king to safety, and white plays h3, hitting the bishop, who drops all the way back to d7. White develops his knight to e2, probably rushing to catch up in development, and black pushes e4, gaining substantial space in the center. White's queen h4 hints at a potential kingside pawn storm at some point, and black develops his knight to a6 before white plays a3 to stop the knight from jumping any further. Black's next move, c6, tries to get rid of white's advanced pawn, and Fischer counters with b4, kicking black's bishop back to d6. White then takes the pawn on c6, and after black recaptures, white develops his bishop to b2, staring down the long diagonal. Black develops his queen to b6, and white, with a touch of recklessness, castles queenside, where all of black's pieces are ready for the attack. For now, black calmly activates his rook on the semi-open e-file, and white storms through with g4. Black counters with c5, and white hits right back with g5. Now black could probably ignore this threat on his knight, and take on b4 to open up the queenside, but instead he decides to jump his knight to h5. Now white could take that knight for free, but maybe Fischer thinks that his queen might be passive on the h5 square, so he instead develops his bishop to g2, and from this point forward, black doesn't let up. He takes on b4, hitting white's knight, who jumps to d5 with an attack on black's queen. She drops to b7, counterattacking the knight, and that knight jumps again, this time to f6 with check, trying to force open the black king side. Black doesn't take the knight with his pawn, however, taking it with his knight to keep his king's shelter intact, and after Fischer takes with his pawn, black grabs the pawn on a3, threatening a checkmate with queen takes b2. This pawn is also protected, so white's bishop has to move and it goes to c3. But black pushes his pawn another square to a2, threatening a checkmate on b1. Fischer desperately plays d3, giving his king some air, but unfortunately, black has a move here that wins the game. Can you find how black can force a checkmate against arguably the best chess player ever? Now black almost has checkmate here, if not for the white king's only escape square. But black can take that away, and the move he plays to do that is the brilliant e3. Fischer, surely shocked, resigns the game. Now queen b1 is virtually an unstoppable checkmate. But wait a second, black's last pawn push opened up white's bishop, and black's queen is fully hanging. But were white to take that queen, we'd realize that black had another threat, that being bishop to a3. With the black pawns suffocating white's king, white's only defense would be to block with the bishop. But then, black would push his pawn to promotion, giving checkmate by exploiting the pin on white's bishop. Use my link in the description to sign up for a chess.com membership, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.